Welcome to Global Creative Writing, exploring expressive styles of all continents. Today we are going to explore travelogues, written about adventures in Antarctica. We'll look at the history of exploration to Antarctica, see how some travel journals were written, and we'll write a travelogue together. A travelogue is a piece of writing about travel, often recorded in a log, journal, or diary. It can also be later presented together with photographs or movies. Explorers of Antarctica created enthralling accounts of their adventures by documenting their daily lives. Antarctica, the continent that surrounds the South Pole, is unique in many ways. It has no native people, as it is too cold for permanent habitation. And it is the territory of no one country. It is the last continent to be discovered and explored. Even the first person to get close to spotting it, James Cook, dismissed the landmass as unreachable. Cook, whose voyages can be seen here, believed that because the waters surrounding the continent were so icy and the path was so dangerous, no one would ever venture farther than he had to properly discover the continent. We can see here that Cook, in his ship Resolution, reached very near Antarctica during the American Revolutionary War. They were stopped by sea ice, though, and only reached the continent's outer islands, and not the mainland of Antarctica itself. On January 9th, 1773, Cook wrote, "We hoisted out 3 boats and took up as much as yielded about 15 tons of fresh water. The Adventure at the same time got about 8 or 9, and all this was done in 5 or 6 hours' time. The pieces we took up, and which had broke from the main island, were very hard and solid, and some of them too large to be handled, so that we were obliged to break them with our ice axes before they could be taken into the boats." From Cook's Journal, number 2. Cook wrote in his diary that even if someone did make it to Antarctica, quote, "the world will derive no benefit from it." Thankfully, James Cook was wrong. Here's a brief look at the history of exploration in Antarctica and why Cook vastly underestimated what this continent had in store. To really explore the continent's history, we have to go back far before Cook first crossed the Antarctic Circle. The idea of a large southern continent had been around for ages. In fact, the name Antarctica was coined far before anyone was even close to actually finding it. The ancient Greeks supposed that such a continent could exist, and it was a lucky guess, based mostly on the assumption that there had to be some landmass to balance out the northern continents. The North Pole was called the Arctos, the Greek word for bear, after the constellation that hung in the northern sky. Greek philosophers assumed there must be an anti-Arctos continent on the South Pole. Cook's dismissal of the benefits of finding Antarctica didn't dissuade the most adventurous and ambitious sailors from continuing to try. On January 27, 1820, Fabian von Bellingshausen became the first person to spot land south of the Antarctic Circle. Later, John Davis was the first to land on Antarctica, and he stepped onto the continent in 1821. Davis's A Letter from the Antarctic was issued for private circulation in 1901, 60 years after the events occurred. The 38-page booklet is in the form of a letter that Davis wrote to his sister Emily, starting on April 11, 1842, from off Cape Horn. Captain Davis was second master of HMS Terror, which traveled with its sister ship, the HMS Erebus. The events described in the letter stretch from November 23, 1841 to May 2, 1842. The centerpieces of the letter are the description of a fierce gale on January 20, 1842, that destroyed or heavily damaged the rudders of both the Erebus and the Terror, and the awful morning of the 13th of March, 1842, when the two ships collided amongst tower icebergs and miraculously escaped complete destruction. John Davis was a talented artist, as you can see in his illustration here. Davis later captained the Aurora for the 1911 to 1914 Australasian Antarctic Expedition, known as the AAE. The expedition encountered many challenges: dangerous weather, navigating previously uncharted coastline, and problems with the ship, which he published in his 1919 book entitled With the Aurora in the Antarctic, 1911 to 1914. He also wrote Willis Island, a storm warning station in the Coral Sea, in 1921, and a collection of his journal entries was published in 1997 entitled Trial by Ice. Although today you can easily and safely visit Antarctica, the first voyages there were more harrowing journeys, often logged in the captain's journal. The ice was a big problem for ships that had neither the strength nor technology to stand up to the pressure as the frozen water expanded. If crews did manage to land, their time on the continent was spent facing the risk of frostbite, starvation, and dehydration. In 1911, two groups of explorers began the race to become the first to reach the South Pole. Roald Amundsen, an explorer from Norway, originally wanted to be the first to reach the North Pole, a title that was taken before he had finished planning the voyage. Instead, he decided to head south. This was at approximately the same time that Captain Robert F. Scott, a British naval officer, was also leading a crew to Antarctica. Amundsen, eager to reach the pole first, began his expedition ahead of schedule. This paid off, despite being a risky move. Amundsen reached the pole well before Scott and his men. Here is his journal entry on that fateful day. On the morning of December 14th, the weather was of the finest, just as if it had been made for arriving at the pole. I am not quite sure, but I believe we dispatched our breakfast rather more quickly than usual and were out of the tent sooner, though I must admit that we always accomplished this with all reasonable haste. We went in the usual order: the Forerunner, Hansen, Wisting, Bjaaland, and the reserve Forerunner. By noon we had reached 89 degrees 53 minutes by dead reckoning, and made ready to take the rest in one stage. At 10 a.m., a light breeze had sprung up from the southeast, and it had clouded over, so that we got no noon altitude. But the clouds were not thick, and from time to time we had a glimpse of the sun through them. The going on that day was rather different from what it had been. Sometimes the ski went over it well, but at others it was pretty bad. We advanced that day in the same mechanical way as before. Not much was said, but eyes were used all the more. Hansen's neck grew twice as long as before in his endeavor to see a few inches farther. I had asked him before we started to spy out ahead for all he was worth, and he did so with a vengeance. But, however keenly he stared, he could not descry anything but the endless, flat plain ahead of us. The dogs had dropped their scenting and appeared to have lost their interest in the regions about the Earth's axis. At 3 in the afternoon, a simultaneous halt rang out from the drivers. They had carefully examined their sledge meters, and they had all showed the full distance. Our pole, by reckoning. The goal was reached. The journey ended. I cannot say, though I know it would sound much more effective, that the object of my life was attained. That would be romancing rather too barefacedly. I had better be honest and admit straight out that I have never known any man to be placed in such a diametrically opposite position to the goal of his desires as I was at that moment. The regions around the North Pole? Well, yes, the North Pole itself had attracted me from childhood, and here I was at the South Pole. Can anything more topsy-turvy be imagined? Roald Amundsen at the South Pole on December 14th, 1911. When Scott reached the pole and discovered he had been beaten, he and his companions turned around to return back home. Sadly, they died on their way back to the ship. Scott's account is preserved in his log. Wednesday, January 17th, Camp 69, the pole. Yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. We have had a horrible day. Add to our disappointment a headwind 4 to 5, with a temperature minus 22 degrees, and companions laboring on with cold feet and hands. And then sadly, 2 months later, we shall stick it out to the end. But we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott. Last entry. For God's sake, look after our people. Amundsen recounted their adventures in a book entitled The South Pole, published a year later in 1912. Perhaps the most exciting story of Antarctic expeditions is that of Ernest Shackleton and his ship the Endurance. In 1915, Shackleton set out to cross the Antarctic continent, a feat that had never been achieved. As his ship approached land, however, the pack ice grew too thick to pass. As the ice expanded, the Endurance was slowly destroyed. It was trapped for 10 months before the pressure finally broke the ship completely. Here is Shackleton's journey entry from that fateful day. She went today. I was standing by H's sledge at 4:50, saw the funnel dip behind the hummock suddenly, ran up the lookout. At 5 p.m., she went down by the head. The stern, the cause of all the trouble, was the last to go under the water. I cannot write about it. The bergs to the southwest are nearer and have altered their bearings a good deal. Sunday always seems the day on which things happen to us. A seal came close to the camp this morning. With one shot as usual, he'd killed it. The floes seem all loosening up, and water sky all around. With a south-southeast fair wind, and the temp has been up to plus 37 and plus 35 most of the day. All cheerful. Cut a ventilator in the galley, it was so hot. Miraculously, Shackleton and his crew survived. After camping on the ice for another 5 months, they were able to take a lifeboat on a 17-day journey until they reached civilization. Shackleton recounted it all with his book, South, the story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, which he wrote in 1920. And we can see the adventure here in this short video.
Men wanted for hazardous journey. Low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness. Safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in event of success. This is the ad that allegedly appeared in the Times when Sir Ernest Shackleton decided to build a crew for his famous Antarctic expedition. Even though the ad might just be a myth, the journey itself became one of the greatest survival stories of all time. Sir Ernest Shackleton didn't really need any advertisement at all. He was already a legend among British seamen and explorers alike. In 1908, he led the British Antarctic expedition and claimed a Victorian land plateau region of Antarctica for the Crown. In the same expedition, people from Shackleton's party became the first to reach the top of Mount Erebus, Antarctica's second largest volcano. His new daring idea for a hazardous journey gained so much attention from newspapers that soon Sir Shackleton had a crowd of volunteers knocking at his door. He carefully selected only 27 of them, and oh boy, did he choose wisely. They were men of steel, no doubt, knowing what a huge goal they set for themselves. With those men, Ernest Shackleton intended to reach Antarctica and cross the whole continent via the South Pole. Not exactly a walk in the park, if you ask me. On December 5, 1914, they left the shores of South Georgia in a ship called Endurance. Endurance was one of the best ships of its time to deal with ice. She had a sturdy hull, an 85-inch thick keel, and a 350 horsepower steam engine. With all that might, she could ram and break tons of ice with ease. But still, she had one crucial weakness. She was designed to crush the ice, but not to sustain being trapped in it. If she would ever get caught by ice building up around her and pushing with all its weight, she would be crushed by the immense pressure. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. This was a bad year for crossing the icy waters of Weddell Sea. At first, Endurance was managing the drifting ice easily, but on January 18th, it finally overcame her. Huge slabs of drifting ice, called pack ice, have an unpredictable nature. It comes and goes and can turn into a small iceberg in just several days. So, this ice is one of the most dangerous kinds imaginable. The initial hope of Sir Shackleton and his crew was that the ice wouldn't build up around the ship too much. But by the 24th of January, it was obvious that the pressure on the ship's hull would only get worse. The next few days, the crew tirelessly crushed and sawed off the ice around Endurance with their own hands. Not to free the ship completely, that would be impossible, but to push Endurance back and leave the rest of the ice to her engine and keel. This idea was promising, but eventually fell short. The ice in front of the ship was just too strong, and the progress was too small. The only hope for Endurance was if it could stay undamaged until spring. Passing the winter on a ship trapped in ice is no joke. The pressure on the ship's hull was rising, just like the pressure on the seaman's will. If not for Sir Shackleton's skill of managing his crew, this story might have ended right here. But they believed in their captain, who they referred to simply as Boss. He sustained discipline on his ship by implementing a stable routine for each and every crew member. Everyone stayed busy, brightening each day with some kind of fulfillment. They even found a way to play soccer on the ice around the ship. Everyone on the ship knew that their one hope in such a dire situation was Sir Shackleton's command, so their spirit remained untouched. Despite all the effort of shoveling new ice and snow building up around the ship, the pressure on the ship only rose. Spring didn't bring the much-needed relief for the Endurance. From time to time, the crew would hear unpleasant crackles and shock sounds. At first, Shackleton said it was whales passing underneath the ice, but everybody knew that the ship may soon start to crumble. Summer came and went, only to bring more young ice. On October 27th, Shackleton ordered his men to abandon ship, which was already heavily damaged. He promised the crew that he would bring them home, saying it in the most simple and encouraging way he could. "We're going home." But notes in his diary reveal his uncertainty. The task is to reach land with all the members of the expedition. It's hard to write how I feel. The camp was settled about a mile away from the ship. The crew still had some supplies and 3 lifeboats, but the resources were limited, and they were isolated from the world, drifting on ice across the Weddell Sea with no means to get more food. On November 21st, 1915, Endurance is finally crushed and buried under the ice, much like the hope of fulfilling the goal of the expedition. On December 20th, Shackleton decides that they'll head towards what he thought was the nearest land, Paulet Island. What they didn't realize is that the ice they were marching through was drifting toward the east, and Paulet Island was on the west. By the end of their journey through the ice fields, they were even further from land than when they began. Still, this march was not completely pointless. At the end of it, Shackleton and his men spotted another island, Elephant Island. Stepping on solid ground felt like euphoria for 28 tired seamen. First days on land were spent refilling food supplies with wildlife. It was their first warm meal in months. But their joy was overshadowed by one terrible truth. Elephant Island was not much better than a drifting ice slab. They had no way to send a message, and no ships would ever be coming their way. There would be no rescue. But Sir Shackleton wasn't one to surrender and leave his men to certain demise. Instead, he took 1 lifeboat and only 5 men, and went off to find help. Yes, he knew what they were facing. Their destination was back to South Georgia, 800 miles away, and they would have to cross the stormiest part of the ocean with waves more than 50 feet high. Shackleton left command with his righteous right hand, Frank Wild. Allegedly, they were so close they could finish each other's sentences. It was Wilde who helped keep the crew safe. They were cold and didn't have much food, but still, he managed to hold them together well and even built a hut for them from the 2 remaining lifeboats. Meanwhile, Sir Shackleton and the 5 other men started their journey on the 24th of April, 1916. Behind their back, another field of pack ice came and closed off the island from them. There was no turning back. The most fearsome enemy of seamen in the cold is the water itself. If your clothes get wet, there's almost no way to get warm again. Imagine what happened to those men in the little lifeboat going through the huge waves. Ice was building up on the boards of the boat, increasing its weight drastically, along with its chances of sinking. One time, Shackleton thought he saw a line of white skies, a crack in the storm clouds. But he soon realized it was the top of a gigantic wave. This was the inexplicable horror they dealt with as they inched slowly toward South Georgia. During this month-long journey, they witnessed storms unlike any of them had ever seen. They had to fight not only for their own lives, but for the lives of their 22 friends still waiting on Elephant Island to be rescued. Maybe that's what drove them to succeed after all. On May 10th, they finally reached the shores of South Georgia. Not welcoming shores with warm beds and a good meal, be assured. It was rocky cliffs with absolutely no place to land. It took a whole day to manage the landing, and even when they stepped on the ground, it wasn't the victory they already well deserved. They had to climb the cliffs and cross several mountain ridges to get to civilization, and their sheer exhaustion only left them a little time to do so. On their way, Shackleton even restricted himself and his men from sleeping more than 5 minutes at a time, in fear that they wouldn't wake up. When they reached the last ridge, they were at their limit, but suddenly, a familiar sound brought back their energy. A whistle that's used to wake up whalers in the morning. The whalers knew Shackleton, but at this point, it was pretty hard to recognize him. His bad condition alarmed the whalers, and in no time, they were helping to rescue their friends on Elephant Island, and, what a miracle, they were all alive and well. They survived. As Shackleton recalls, he and his 5 comrades were thrilled to find the whaler village, not because they knew they were safe, but because they knew their friends would be saved. And this is how the story of the most miraculous survival ended. Sir Shackleton may have never reached his goals of crossing the Antarctic continent from shore to shore, but his name will always be remembered in the history of Antarctic exploration.
Explorers of Antarctica have shared their adventures with humanity and history by recounting what happened in small details on a daily basis. Shared human experience is a way to preserve, to reflect, and to learn. So let's write a travelogue together.